Today is Tuesday, February 14th, Valentine's Day, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This week, while I was at Mass on Sunday, I was thinking about how common it is for laymen and lay women to criticize the clergy and religious. And I was thinking about the kinds of criticisms that are raised against priests and bishops and monks and nuns. And it dawned on me what the criticism was about. And as I took some time to think about who the popular priests and, like the celebrity religious in our society are, as I thought about who they are and what their characters are like, I realized that they all have one thing in common. And I think that what's happened in Catholic culture is that the influence of Protestantism and secular politics has led to a number of generations of Catholics that have developed a worldview that really isn't Catholic. And it's left them with something of a constant vexation that they can't get the different parts of their lives to work together. They live in this constant spiritual and practical frustration. Now, what I mean specifically by this is that in Protestant circles through history, there has been a complete rejection of Catholic religious vocations. Protestants deny that there is any real Christian priesthood on earth. They deny that Christ calls men and women to celibacy for the kingdom of heaven, and they promote more of a Jewish religion where they emphasize the importance of married life and having children. And they see infant baptism as sort of the way to pass on the Christian faith from one generation to the next. And this is done through reproduction. It's a very Jewish idea. In fact, when Protestants talk about infant baptism, they often justify it by saying it's just like circumcision in the Old Covenant. And for Protestants, it is in fact just like circumcision because that's how they think. They think like Jews about religion, even though we're living under the New Covenant and not as Jews. And so they read the Old Testament and they read passages like God's blessing on Adam and Eve in Genesis, where God says to them, "Be fruitful and multiply." They read that and they bring it into the 21st century and they say, you see, God has told us to be fruitful and multiply, to be married, to have children, and so on. This is what God wants us to do. They read that statement, be fruitful and multiply, almost as if it's a commandment. Be fruitful and multiply. If you have a copy of the Douay-Rheims Bible, I'm not sure if it's in the commentary of the Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible or if it's in the Haydock Bible commentary, but I know it's one of them. It explains that passage, that line, be fruitful and multiply, is not a command. It's a blessing. God is not commanding men to be fruitful and multiply. He's not commanding anyone to have children. He is simply blessing that relationship, that marriage relationship, and the children that it produces. But in Protestantism, that's seen as the goal of life, to be fruitful and multiply, to marry a Christian and to have Christian children. Now that's been normal in Protestantism for 500 years, but Catholics, little by little, especially in American culture, Catholics have sort of embraced that Protestant view as their own. And this has been mingled together with pro-life politics, the obsession with family life and reproduction, fighting against contraception, fighting against abortion, and so on. Family life has almost become the definition of American Catholicism. And this idea of being a Catholic family with lots of children, homeschooling, all of this pro-family, pro-life, lots of children, be fruitful and multiply Christianity has become very common in Catholic circles, so common in fact that there are no more religious vocations at all, and most kids growing up can't even comprehend what the purpose of a religious vocation would be. Back in 2013, I was invited by the monks out at Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma to come and spend, I think it was a week, talking about education, sort of deliberating on classical Catholic education. And while I was going there, I decided to bring a bunch of my students with me and let them come and spend a week at the monastery. And when we were there, these Catholic boys, whose families are into all these sorts of things, the pro-life movement, praying to end abortion, all these sorts of political action groups and activities. When they were there, they commented and said, "What are these monks doing? They don't do anything. They don't do anything." And in this constant judgment of the Benedictine monks was that they don't do anything. They don't do anything. And it's funny because these monks were in the process of building an entire monastery community. They grow their own food. They produce their own tools and equipment. They manage and live in a self-sufficient rural community, building a giant, beautiful monastery. They pray the entire divine office every day. They celebrate the Mass every single day. And despite all of this, constant study, constant prayer, meditation, worship, work, on and on, these modern American Catholic boys look at the lives of these monks and say, they don't do anything. They don't do anything because the stuff that these monks are doing, the life of these celibate men and women, because there's also a community of women at Clear Creek who live separately, of course. This religious life, this celibate life, and the activities and interests of this Catholic celibate life are not even on the radar of these teenage Catholic boys. They can't even comprehend what these Benedictine monks are doing, and the conclusion they draw is they don't do anything. And the reason is because we've defined Christian culture and Christian mission as largely political activity, public activity. And so if men are not marching down Main Street or making banners to carry and hold in front of government buildings or standing on the street corner and praying in public, they're judged to not be doing anything. Even though what these Benedictine monks are doing is the essential mission of the Catholic Church. And so we can see that these boys are being raised in this pro-life Catholic family culture that can't even comprehend religious vocations in the 21st century. And I'd like to argue that this is where American Catholicism has run off the rails. American Catholicism has embraced a Protestant vision of the Catholic life, which sort of terminates in marriage and reproduction, and has no more understanding of religious life, of celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of God. And so most, if not nearly all, Catholic young men and women are rushing into marriage thinking that they are fulfilling God's will by getting married and reproducing, and they are taking verses like "be fruitful and multiply" as the guide of their lives. And we have all of these Catholic weddings, Catholic kids go off to Catholic colleges, meet Catholic partners, get married, they celebrate to have a Catholic marriage, and so on. And there's all of these marriages taking place, there's all of these babies being produced, and what no one is asking, what no one is planning or working for or talking about, is who is going to provide the spiritual and intellectual formation that all of these Catholic children are going to need. It's sort of taken for granted that someone's going to be there to teach the children. Someone's going to be there to celebrate the sacraments. Someone's going to be there for confessions. Someone's going to be there when someone is sick. Someone's going to be there to minister, to pray, to teach, to preach, and so on. And yet no one sees themselves as one of those people who's going to be there when the spiritual blessings and graces of the sacraments are necessary. Someone else, we assume, is going to be there. And so generations of Catholics have run into marriage and family life while no one has gone into religious life. And now all of a sudden we're stuck in this giant cultural crisis where there are married couples and Catholic children all over the place, but there are no teachers, no nuns, no monks, no priests, and so on. And so the spiritual lives of these families is degenerating. The culture of this Catholic family life is degenerating. Catholic culture, because it lacks the spiritual life that it needs to live and actually do its work in the world, has dried up to such a point that Catholic families don't know what to do anymore about these things. And so what happens is these Catholic couples who have gotten married and have had children now all of a sudden find themselves stuck in a situation where they've got all kinds of needs to educate their children. They need help forming the character of their children. They need help catechizing their children. They need other adults to evangelize their children. They need priests to inspire and encourage their children. They have all of these spiritual needs, and there's no one there to fulfill these needs. Now, the problem, I think, is that there aren't more voices like mine saying, look, we have to all admit, and I'm one of these, we have to all admit that we've made a great mistake. We have to admit that we've erred in following a vision of Catholic life that really is Protestant and not Catholic at all. We've really lived in contradiction to what we know to be true of the lives of the saints, of the life of Christ himself, of the life of the Holy Family itself, which had only one child, and that extraordinarily. We've lived in contradiction to all of these Catholic realities, and we've embraced this Protestant vision of the Christian family life, and we've made no provision. We've taken no thought for the spiritual and intellectual and cultural needs that all of these children and all of our families would have down the road. And now we're stuck. We're stuck in a situation where there's tons of kids and no teachers, no priests, no monks, no nuns. And we've got to be honest and admit we've screwed up. We've screwed up. We've embraced this message. We've embraced this vision of Christian family life. Many Catholics who had the opportunity to become priests and monks and nuns chose to marry instead. Cradle Catholics surrounded by stories of saints and virgins and martyrs and priests and monks and nuns from their childhood chose not to pursue that course of life, but to get married. And I can almost guarantee that those who have done so were raised, immersed in the pro-life, pro-family, be fruitful and multiply Catholic way of life. And so here we are with our families, with all of our children, and we've got a long laundry list of needs for those children that can't be fulfilled. And what happens is these parents begin to get frustrated. And instead of admitting, as I just did, that we went into family life with unrealistic, unreasonable expectations for the future, rather than admit that, rather than realize that this Catholic family culture with no religious vocations isn't sustainable spiritually or culturally or intellectually, rather than confessing that, we've chosen to pridefully look around and find someone to blame. And so we go to Mass on Sunday and we look at the parish priest and we say about the parish priest, why doesn't he do more? Why doesn't he offer longer hours for confession? Why doesn't he offer more masses? Why doesn't he organize a school? Why doesn't he visit our families? Why doesn't he organize a better faith formation program? Why doesn't he support homeschool families? Why doesn't he encourage religious vocations? Why doesn't he give more serious homilies? Why doesn't he? And we go on and on and on, blaming the man who did choose to become a priest for not doing the work of dozens of priests that don't exist. Or what we do is we sit home idly and we watch movies about Padre Pio and John Bosco, and we get this idea of the super priest. And remember, it's a condensed movie that takes, in the case, for example, of John Bosco. John Bosco's ministry with the boys in the 19th century went on for 50 years. And we condense 50 years of activity into a 1.5 hour or 2 hour movie. I always complain about soccer, that soccer is the most boring sport ever invented. And yet we can go on YouTube and we can find highlights of soccer games, and the highlights of soccer games are some of the most exciting sports highlights that exist. If we judge soccer based on the 7-minute highlight video, we might say that soccer is the most exciting sport in the world. And then we take that idea, this 5-minute condensed highlight reel of the most exciting moments of the game, or of multiple games, and we take that expectation to an actual soccer match, and we sit there for 90 minutes bored out of our minds to watch a 1-1 draw with no excitement at all. And this is sort of the delusion of the highlight reel. And these saint movies are like highlight reels. We get to watch all of the most exciting events from the saints' lives in a matter of minutes as we sit on the couch drinking our coffee, watching a movie. And then we take that standard of excitement, all of that excitement and zeal from that condensed life of one of the historically most extraordinary priests to ever live, and we go to the local parish thinking that the excitement and zeal of that highlight reel should be present at the local parish in the day-to-day ministry of the one lonely guy who actually chose to pursue the Catholic priesthood. And our expectation of the priest is just so unreasonable and ridiculous that really it's laughable. It's laughable how ridiculous the expectation is. And so we've created this dilemma in Catholic society. There are no priests, relatively speaking. Don't be a smart aleck and say, yes, there are. There were 2 ordained. Yeah, that's right. There were 2 out of thousands and thousands and thousands of Catholics. There are relatively, if we were to look at percentage, what percentage of Catholics become priests, monks, or nuns? It's 0%. 0%. So there are relatively no religious, no clergy out of the Catholic community. And then we go into adult life watching saint movies, reading historical books about Catholic life, and we go to the local parish expecting to be able to do all of these things and enjoy all of these things and play with all of these benefits that someone else is supposed to prepare for us. And it's just a laughably ridiculous expectation. And so what happens is these Instagram families, all prepared for all of the family photos they would imagine that they would have one day, all of the celebrations that they imagined that they would have one day, all of this romantic family culture that they looked forward to, they start to realize that they're not going to have it because their kids aren't turning out to be the kind of kids they thought they would be. Their family life isn't turning out to be what they thought it would be. the culture of their Catholic life isn't what they idly imagined that it would be, because there isn't an army of angels and monks and nuns and priests running around preparing the scene for them every day. They're constantly picking themselves up by their own bootstraps. They're the ones who have to lead the prayers. They're the ones who have to organize the studies. They're the ones who have to teach the faith formation classes. They're the ones who have to volunteer. They've got lay people serving as Eucharistic ministers, on and on and on. And this is not the fantasy Catholic culture that they dreamed about in college when they planned their Catholic wedding and family life. And so what they do, as I said, is they turn at the bishops and the priests and the monks and the nuns, and they blame them as if these priests and bishops and monks and nuns have failed them, as if they're unfaithful, as if they're all lazy, they're all worldly. None of them are devout. None of them are saintly. None of them are any good. And they just bash and bash and bash and criticize the people who actually chose to devote their lives to religion, because they don't do everything by themselves. And so I think that this culture, the more I think about it, the more I pay attention to it, I think this culture in our generation that criticizes the Pope and the bishops and the priests and the deacons and the monks and the nuns and the schools and the seminaries, I think that this critical Catholic culture, this frustrated, nasty Catholic culture, is linked to this problem, that they fell into a Protestant view of the Catholic life. And what they're stuck with is they're basically stuck with a Protestant life with Catholic expectations. They live a Protestant life with Catholic expectations. I could even say they live a Protestant life with Catholic decorations added to it. And this is the real cause of this frustration. It's not the priest's fault. It's not the bishop's fault. The bishops have no money. The priests have no more time or energy. They're not responsible to sit in a confessional for 22 hours because Padre Pio did that in a movie. The expectations are not just. They're not reasonable. And if anyone has no right to have those expectations, it's all of these Catholics who, when they were young adults, were thinking of their own fantasy married lives and nothing of the spiritual life of their children, nothing of the sacramental ministry of the church, nothing of the needs of the church. And yet they blame all of these shortcomings on the people who are actually doing that work and participating in that ministry. It's really an insane criticism that fills them, as if they're just allowed to indulge in conjugal life and reproduce and fill their homes with babies, and somebody else is responsible to sacrifice their life, to devote their life to religion, to devote themselves to celibacy for the kingdom of God, so that all of these kids being born by these Catholic married people can have all of the spiritual care and attention that they need. It's an insane, selfish expectation. And rather than confess and I don't mean this in a negative way, rather than simply admit that we are partly responsible for this problematic situation that we live in. Many simply turn and blame all of the problems on these religious and clergy. And that's, I think, where this angry Catholic lay culture that blames and criticizes the clergy constantly comes from. It's frustrated Protestantish Catholics who have chosen to live like Protestants and are frustrated that they don't have all of the benefits of the lives of Catholics. They don't have the devotion of monks and nuns. They don't have the sacramental life of monks and nuns and of priests. They're frustrated and they imagine that those who are in ministry should be working overtime, chasing them around, making sure that they have everything they want. And it's just an insane, unhappy view of life in the church. Now, I admit that I made this error when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. I was thinking about nothing but getting married to the woman who I loved. And even though I can say that, I can admit that as I was studying, as I was living before I was married, I had all kinds of thoughts about things that I could devote my life to instead of getting married. I wasn't a Catholic. I didn't have thoughts of Catholic religious life or priesthood, but I had thoughts of missionary work I could do and things like that I could do instead of getting married. But I didn't pay much attention to those thoughts. I was excited about being married for all kinds of carnal, selfish reasons. Obvious carnal, selfish reasons. I was excited about having my own place and having life with my wife. I was excited about being able to be with my wife and not have to go home at the end of the day. I was excited about all of the comforts of married life, sitting down together for dinner, getting up in the morning and having breakfast and coffee together. I was thinking of all of the comforts of married life. And that's all that I was thinking about when I was 22 years old. And when my wife and I went into marriage, we were excited about this prospect of having lots of kids and having a Christian family and all this. And as we were running into all of this, with all of this young, immature Christian zeal, we really weren't counting the costs of everything that would be needed 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And what happened in our family, and what I think is happening in many other families, is we got to a point where the demand for spiritual help simply became greater than the supply of that help. Our needs overwhelmed the available resources. And when this happened, my wife and I went through some times of crisis and frustration and confusion, and yet we didn't point fingers at the priest or at religious or anything. We just sort of laughed to ourselves at how impossible it is. It's impossible. The needs that are produced by our family with all of our children, spiritual needs, the difficulty just of getting to Mass as a large family. So many practical concerns, so many practical challenges, so many things. Every time your family is going to pray, you have to marshal all the kids together and form this assembly. And as we got into it, And as our kids got older and our family got larger, we realized that the expectations we had were simply not realistic. And the reality was that the children that we're developing in our home were the children that we actually deserve. They're the children that we actually provided for. And the problems that they had, the gaps in their formation, the lack of encouragement, the lack of support, the lack of direction and support from priests or from religious, that has a real effect. That leaves real deficiencies in their spiritual lives, and it's not prepared for. It's not provided for. And we simply think that we're going to make these kids and have these children and build this giant family, and we don't take into consideration the spiritual costs of raising and keeping that family together. So there came a point in my life as a father where I realized what was happening. I realized that this spiritual need was beginning to get ahead of our spiritual supply. I knew that I couldn't look to my priest, who's busy enough already doing everything he can within human reason. I couldn't look to my priest. I couldn't make demands of others. I had to realize that this quality of life had to be embraced and made the most of. Because this really is, this is the reality of this American Catholic vision of big family life. And I know we can find isolated examples of just absolutely abundant, beautiful Catholic families with lots of kids. I know those people. I've taught many of those kids. I've been friends with many of those Catholic parents. But they usually have unique circumstances that aren't taken into consideration when we talk about these things. Many of them, for example, have devout uncles and aunts or grandparents who help in raising the kids, who help building and supporting that Catholic culture and so on. These sort of behind-the-scenes invisible workers often don't get the credit that they deserve. They may have extraordinary local parishes in God's providence where there are a number of active, young, zealous priests who take ministering to families very seriously. They may live in a place where there are good Catholic schools or there's a supportive Catholic bishop, and really it's providential that they have the support that they need as their children grow up. But it can't be expected in every place. It can't be counted on or trusted that it's going to show up. And when it doesn't show up, we can't point fingers and blame the religious for not raising our children for us, for not ministering to our children at our convenience. And so we're left with something of a minimalistic Catholic culture, and it's important for us to understand this because we have to ask. It's just like being materially poor. If a family is materially poor, they have to ask, what are the most important things? What are the things we really have to make sure we budget for and provide for? Because our resources are limited. We've got to make sure we've got bread. We've got to make sure that we've got basic foods and clothing provided for, and we can't waste money on anything unnecessary. Well, the same thing I think happens spiritually. When you realize that you've only got so much in terms of spiritual resources, you've got to ask, what's the most essential thing? what are the most important things, and make sure that they're established as priorities, and you don't pursue things that are sort of out of your reach and beyond the reality of your circumstances. It's like the saying, to have wine taste but a beer pocketbook. You have the money to afford a beer, and yet you're looking for wine. I think many Catholic families who've bought into this American Catholic family life vision, they're expecting to drink wine, and they've barely got any money for a beer. And so, as a Catholic parent, I realized I really need to understand that, spiritually speaking, our family is poor. Our family is spiritually poor. We don't have an abundance of spiritual riches. And these spiritual riches need to be divided among all of our children. And so we had to ask, what are the most essential things that we need to make sure that all of the children have, without getting distracted and worrying about second or third level things that really we can't spiritually afford to give our children or sustain as a family. And so I can just share that for me, I looked at the church and I said, well, the church gives us precepts of the church. These are essential commandments of the Catholic life. We have to make sure we focus on them. They're like our food and clothing, spiritually speaking. We have to make sure that we observe the precepts of the church. We don't get so worried about doing other things or going beyond them that we end up neglecting these things. And we see many Catholics do that. We see many Catholics who will be pursuing extraordinary things spiritually with sort of a spiritual covetousness, and they'll neglect things that are actually commanded them, like remembering to support the local parish. They'll be organizing spiritual pilgrimages for themselves to go travel and visit places, and they're not even supporting their local parish, which is a commandment of the church, an essential thing. Making sure they attend Mass every Sunday, making sure that they make confession at least once a year, that they receive communion at least once a year during the Easter season. As we talk about the precepts of the church, some will even scoff at them, and yet they won't observe them. And so, realizing that our family, with our large number of kids, was going to be a spiritually poor family, even though we might be materially wealthy, we might be intellectually wealthy, we were going to be spiritually needy. And so my wife and I simplified our expectations, and we sought to make sure that our children all understood and practiced the essentials of the faith. And I think that saved us from errors that I've seen other families make that have led to all kinds of unfortunate outcomes. Now, our kids have struggled spiritually for many different reasons. And again, remember, my wife and I are the only Catholics in our family, so there's no support for our Catholic life outside of mom and dad in our family. So our kids grew up where Catholicism was not something that was shared by family members or other relatives. And that has a negative effect on the kids. And we set our expectations accordingly, understanding that when our kids say things or do things or think things, that there are lots of influences other than just ours that have an effect on them, and they're not necessarily rejecting Catholicism out of some kind of paradise of Catholic pleasure, but they're living in a difficult place where Catholic resources are scarce, and the only voices that are usually promoting these Catholic ideas are mom and dad, and the whole world is contradicting mom and dad and telling the kids they don't need to listen to mom and dad. Even other Catholics who don't like my view about this or that have directly spoken to my children and encouraged them to ignore things that I taught them, which is just pure evil. And yet this is the kind of stuff I talk about that goes on behind the scenes in Catholic circles, which doesn't get talked about much on social media. But the kids grow up and they lack confidence in their Catholic mother and father. And they go into young adult life and they have their own opinions. They've got all this counsel from other people, all these other voices in their heads. And they go out and they explore. And so we have to ask, what are the most essential things? And for us, in our family, we have very affectionate, close relationships. We have very strong, happy family culture. Our children understand that their parents love them, that they're always welcome home, that they're always loved, that anything they do, no matter how bad it might be, will always be forgiven, that they will always be given second chances, that there will always be a warm reception, just like we read about in the story of the prodigal son. And our children, in those things which we were abundant in, our children are abundant in those things. My children are off to successful military careers, successful college careers, all their tuition and expenses paid. My oldest two children are cadets in officer training in the military. Intellectually, they're abundant. Materially, they're wealthy. But spiritually, because of this error in this ill-informed American Catholic culture, spiritually, they're poor. And so we've got to live and think and talk and work with an understanding of that reality and not expect from our children bricks when they're given no straw, as it were. And we've had to learn to understand how to deal with this problem as parents and to make wise decisions as to how to deal with our children, how to help our children, how to manage our family, and so on. And it's quite complex business, but this is the consequence of this Protestantish American view of Christian life, which cranks out the children and takes no thought for where the spiritual resources are going to come from that these children are going to need, especially as the families multiply and the spiritual resources, the ministers and teachers and confessors are not multiplying. And that's a problem that I believe as lay people we've gotten ourselves into. And I'm not sure how we're going to get out of it, because it's going to take a generation of Catholics who say, inasmuch as I love the thought of getting married and having a family, I also know that celibacy for the kingdom of God is taught by the church to be an objectively superior life, and it's necessary for the spiritual welfare of all Catholics, and therefore I'm going to pursue that religious life. It's going to take a generation of Catholic kids, a generation that we chose not to be, to change that. And I can say that I do believe that the work that we're doing to restore classical Catholic education, to reintroduce Catholic children to the study of philosophy, to the study of theology, to the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, to the actual studies that the saints were immersed in, I think it's going to have a significant impact on the number of children who choose to pursue religious vocations. I know it already has. We've already had a good number of students go on to religious vocations from the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, even though, in my opinion, we're still just getting organized. We've already seen the first fruits of classical Catholic studies, and that's sort of my offering, my penitential offering for my own errors in misjudging the Christian life and thinking that I could just go and marry and be fruitful and multiply, not thinking of the spiritual needs that would arise because of that. And in response to that one passage, that be fruitful and multiply, there's a passage in the writing of St. Augustine. I believe it was St. Augustine. I have to look for it. It just came to mind as I was talking. There's a passage, it's either St. Augustine or St. Jerome, maybe even St. John Chrysostom. I can think that I was reading all three of those at the same time when I remember this passage, but they explain that be fruitful and multiply was the model of life for the Jews under the Old Covenant, and that go into the world and make disciples is the model of Christian life under the New Covenant. That the physical family life, the physical reproduction that the Old Covenant Jewish culture focused on, where the mark of the covenant was sealed in the flesh of the physical child, is superseded in the New Covenant by spiritual reproduction through the preaching of the gospel, through religious vocations and spiritual mission and apostolate in the Christian life. And it's symbolized not by any mark made in the flesh, but in the sacrament of baptism, which is a sign of a spiritual circumcision of the heart. So that's something to think about. But I think that we have erred as Catholics. I think that we've embraced a Protestant, American, worldly, political view of life, and that this has led us to rush into family life somewhat irresponsibly, and we're dealing with the consequences. And this is not a negative criticism of family life, because I think we simply have to adjust our expectations and lovingly consider that our children really do face difficulties where we expect of them spiritual fruits that we really haven't provided sufficiently for in their lives. And we've got to learn to be more patient, to be more humble, to acknowledge that we've been mistaken in ideas that we've had. We've been influenced by ungodly sources, and we can't take that out on our pastors and on our bishops and on the religious who are ministering around us, and we can't take it out on our children. We've got to point the finger at ourselves and say, I went into family life with unreasonable expectations, practicing and thinking things that have come from Protestant sources or Jewish sources, and I've gone into the Catholic life expecting for Catholic saints to come out of this physical, carnal family culture, and I've made errors in judgment, and I need to adjust my expectations, love my children, appreciate and support the religious who are active in the church, and do the best that I can to make the best of this situation and try to try to eradicate this false view of life, of Catholic life, for the next generation. And I know in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, that's certainly what I'm working to do. And as I said, we're already beginning to see the first fruits of that commitment. I hope that's helpful. God bless.